I recently sent a newsletter to my subscribers, and the topic of the newsletter was bodybuilding got me here, but it won't get me there. And it created a little bit of confusion. I got some questions on this. And what I was really referring to is a phrase that is often thrown around, particularly in the online entrepreneur business world. It's one that I've heard in masterminds and in business groups that I've been into for online coaching. And it is this: what got me here won't get me there. Basically referring to whatever I've been doing up to a certain point got me to this point, but now I want to progress to the next point. And in order to do that, I need to change my thinking and maybe add a few things in. So what got me here won't get me there. And I referred to bodybuilding. Now, does that mean that I'm no longer doing any bodybuilding? Well, I'm not competing right now, but I am still following that lifestyle. I strength train about 5 times per week. My diet is dialed in. I'm getting enough protein. So, of course, strength training is still number one to me. I still see it as a queen. And one of the most important things that we can do, if not the most important thing we can do for longevity, so the length of our life, and then also the quality of our life, which is referred to as health span, a little bit different than lifespan because it's the quality of those years. So, yes, it's number one. But what I'm finding as I dive into exercise physiology, some of the research, I am learning that there are other things we need in our exercise routine in order to maximize health, reach optimal health, and to prepare for those later years when we need that strength, that agility. Uh, we are more prone to falls and we need to prevent those. Or if we do have a fall, we want to be strong enough that we don't wind up breaking a hip, which is often what happens to people in general, but especially to women, is they will break a hip and oftentimes they do not recover from that if they're over the age of 65. They might not even survive the incident. So I am finding that there are certain things with exercise physiology that we need to incorporate, and the sooner the better. And yes, strength training is up there, but there's more. Hello, and welcome to the Forever Fit with Carol Covino podcast. I'm your host, Carol Covino. I'm a health, fitness, and nutrition coach for women who are nearing 50 and over. I help these ladies to lose the body fat for good and to tone and strengthen their bodies. Let's dive into the content. So, what do we need to get there? What do we need in the future? We're going to start with the strength training piece. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but I just want to talk about a few facts concerning strength training and why it needs to be number one. So, first of all, we know women have less muscle than men. That's an obvious one, especially in the upper body. We tend to carry more muscle in our lower body as women. But when we transitioned out of perimenopause and into menopause, research shows we become more vulnerable to losing muscle mass. So, in other words, that accelerates. We begin losing muscle mass at an accelerated rate. And this is because of fluctuation and the loss of our sex hormones. So there's been some muscle cell studies that show when researchers take estrogen away from animals, their ability to regenerate muscle stem cells can drop 30 to 60%. I'll say that again. So the research on muscle cell studies shows that when estrogen is taken away from laboratory animals, their ability to regenerate muscle stem cells drops significantly, anywhere from 30 to 60%. Now, of course, we're not animals, and the degree that this would transfer to us is unknown. However, I think the research does show, yes, we indeed lose that ability to build and retain muscle. They've done muscle biopsies in women during menopause, And that shows the exact same thing. So it actually reinforces the findings of that study. Another study was done in 2021, so relatively recent within the last couple of years, and it found that women in late perimenopause, now perimenopause is that transition into menopause where hormones begin to fluctuate, in particular estrogen and progesterone. And what the study found with these women in late perimenopause, that they had 10% less skeletal muscle in their arms and legs than women in early perimenopause. So early perimenopause typically means it can be the early 40s, nearing the mid 40s. It just depends on the woman. Some women go into perimenopause in their mid to late 30s. So in those earlier perimenopausal years where the hormone fluctuations start, we are not as vulnerable to losing muscle. But as soon as we hit the later perimenopausal years, which are typically going to be in the late 40s into the 50s, this changes and we have 10% less muscle in our arms and legs. Now, late perimenopausal women and postmenopausal women were more likely to develop sarcopenia. And that's just a fancy word for age-related muscle loss. It can also mean involuntary muscle loss. So they were more likely to develop this condition of sarcopenia, muscle loss, than early perimenopausal or premenopausal women. So once again, the further away the women are from menopause, the greater their ability is to retain muscle. And the closer we are to menopause, the more likely we are to lose skeletal muscle. So maintaining skeletal muscle is essential for strength, power, and then endurance as well. Just being able to go about our daily lives. We need it for living life. So this muscle mass is a predictor of longevity in adults 65 and older, especially for women. So there was a Brazilian study done, and there were 839 older adults. It was found that mortality risk increased in women with low muscle mass in their arms and legs by nearly 63-fold during the 4-year study period. And this is compared to an 11.4-fold increase in mortality risk among men. So you can see men are at a far less risk. So basically that risk was increasing 63-fold as women aged, and this is the risk of mortality. Another study done more recently, it was in 2022, and they looked at 1,200 women and men aged 40 and older and found that skeletal muscle mass was a better predictor of mortality, how long you live. It's a better predictor than BMI or fat mass. So typically you go to the doctor, they're still looking at BMI, which is the height and the weight. They're oftentimes not taking into account muscle mass. They're not taking into account skeletal frame. It's a poor predictor. Another 2022 study, there were 115,489 participants. Over 70,000 were women, so a good amount were women, and they were aged 65 to 74, and they found that 2 to 6 training sessions, strength training sessions per week were associated with a lower risk of death from any cause, so all-cause mortality. So just doing anywhere from 2 to 6. I do 5 to 6 because I enjoy it, and I do live more of that bodybuilding lifestyle where I want to have the aesthetics and the balance of the muscles. But I have female clients doing just 2 to 3 strength training sessions per week, and they are getting results that you can visibly see and they can feel. So muscle is protective of our health. Number one, you can remain active and independent as you age. Number two, it actually pulls the blood sugar or the glucose from your bloodstream without needing insulin. So if you have muscle, you don't need insulin to pull that blood glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cells where it belongs. Thus, it lowers the risk of insulin resistance, which is a huge risk for women over 50. Skeletal muscle is good for our heart. So, when it comes to cardiovascular health, women should definitely be prioritizing strength training, resistance training, building muscle over weight loss. So, really prioritizing, let me put on muscle. And I did a podcast on this, it was quite some time ago, where I talk about shifting the focus from the scale to gaining muscle, because a lot of times when you take that step towards strength training, many other things begin to fall into place. So there was a 2021 study that found that women with high muscle mass are less likely to die from heart disease, and that fat mass was not as big of a heart disease risk in women as in men. But the main thing I want you to take away from that study is the fact that women with high muscle mass are less likely to die from heart disease. So even if you did nothing else and began to work on your muscle, you are increasing your chances of longevity and quality of life health span. Number four, regular muscle strengthening exercise has been linked to a lower risk of cancer and diabetes. Number five, muscle loss can compromise your bones. You can lose your bone density. And this is something as a woman that we just cannot allow to happen because we're already at an increased risk. So as soon as we lose estrogen, going through menopause, and even if you're doing HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and you're taking some form of estrogen, it's still not quite the same as what your body would produce. That's my personal feeling on that, and the levels tend to be lower than what your body would produce. So we are at risk for losing bone density. Very, very important to look at your skeletal health and to maintain that muscle. Number six, strength or resistance training can speed up or increase your metabolism so that you are burning more fat, and it does this both during and after training. It can also potentially reduce visceral belly fat, that deep body fat that wraps around our organs and is so dangerous and a predictor of chronic disease. So these are some pretty good benefits to strength training. And I really want you to maybe re-listen to this podcast, jot them down, and consider some of the research and what it's shown and what strength training can do for you. So if you're not currently strength training or you used to and you stopped, I would encourage you to pick that up again. Just 2 days a week can make a difference. Now, moving into cardio. So this is the component I've talked about zone 2 cardio, which is very beneficial for longevity, and the studies are overwhelming in this area. In zone 2, it isn't that middle zone. So if you think of the zone 1 as being a warm-up, kind of easy walking the dog zone, or just moving around the house doing some simple tasks, then you think of zone 2 as one level up, and you're aware you're working, you're breathing a little bit harder, the heart rate is going up, but if you were out on a jog or a hike, you would still be able to converse with a friend if you were with a friend exercising. So you're aware you're exercising, you can feel the increase in breathing, but it's not to that level where it's uncomfortable to talk. Zone 3 is that mid-level. That was the one that they used to tell us in the 90s in particular. I remember this from the 90s. It was all about in these cycling classes or spin classes, getting up to zone 3 and holding it there. And that's where all the fat burning benefits are. That type of endurance cardio tends to be counterproductive for women. And I'm going to explain why. I'm going to share a study and I'm going to talk about this because this is important for us as women to unpack. That we don't need to be spending a lot of time in that mid zone. Now, we might cross that zone if we're cycling or hiking a little bit. We don't need to get fanatical about it, but you just don't want to be going on those long runs where you're in zone 3 for 2 hours and you're doing this several times per week. So let's talk about the study. There was a study that was published in the Journal of Sports Sciences, and then it was actually covered in Outside Magazine. If you've ever read Outside Magazine, it's just basically about activities, outdoor activities. And it showed improvements in cardio function in post-menopausal women, so they'd already gone through menopause, who were exposed to blood withdrawal plus endurance training. So they were doing endurance exercise and they were having their blood drawn. And that may seem weird when I first read this. I'm like, what? I don't get it. I had to read it 3 times to understand why they were doing this and why this was a study. So these women were mainly unresponsive to endurance training, and we're going to talk about why they were unresponsive to endurance training. So they needed some extra stress and the good kind of stress, the good kind of cardiac stress to go along with it. So the endurance just by itself simply wasn't enough, and we're going to unpack that. So in the study, 15 women they were moderately active, they weren't athletic women, and they were ages 52 to 75. They had a blood draw of about a pint of blood withdrawn, and they had 3 weeks to partially recover their hemoglobin mass and oxygen carrying capacity. I know this is getting a little bit sciencey, but bear with me, it's going to make more sense. So they needed to recover that hemoglobin mass and oxygen carrying capacity that they lost with the blood draw. And then they participated in an 8-week training program that included 2 to 5 sessions of short, high intensity intervals with a 2 to 1 work to recovery ratio. So basically, maybe 30-second sprints on the stair stepper or a bike or running, and then 15 seconds recovery. So kind of in that Tabata type workout. And again, the reason they were doing this is the researchers deemed that these women were not going to get the amount of stress that they needed from simply endurance cardio. That's what the studies were showing. They weren't getting enough of a good cardiac stress that they needed in order to respond. And this is why the HIIT intervals were used. In the end, the women were able to consume more oxygen at any given heart rate than they could before the blood draw and before the exercise training. The main finding was that their left ventricle, which is the part of the heart chamber that's responsible for pumping blood, oxygenated blood to all the tissues throughout your body, was actually remodeled. I know it's kind of a funny word, but it was remodeled and its function improved, got better. So the combination of the blood draw and then the amount of time they waited to recover and then to get into the HIIT. So when you give blood, your body restores the plasma pretty quickly. I've given blood many, many times, but it takes longer to restore the oxygen carrying red blood cells. So basically you have less oxygen for your heart to go around, and your heart has to work a little bit harder to give your muscles the oxygen that it needs. So you have less oxygen in your body and your heart has to work harder. So now why does all of this matter? And I know I kind of went down the rabbit hole, but remember at the beginning, and I'm just scrolling through my notes, where it talked about they did have improvements in cardio function in postmenopausal women when they had the blood drawn and they combined that with endurance training. So they did have some benefits, but they had greater benefits when they introduced the HIIT training after they had recovered from the blood draw. So I just want to clarify that because it does, I had to read the study several times to understand that. So where I'm going with all this is women's bodies are made for endurance. Women are just naturally good at endurance activity, and it may be why as women that we tend to just gravitate toward it, and we tend to gravitate toward running those marathons or doing those long steady state endurance sessions. So there's been some research that has shown that women's muscles actually extract oxygen from the blood faster than men. So we might not need that remodeling in response to pure endurance exercise because it's not enough of a stimulus on our bodies because of how we're able to extract that oxygen so much quicker than men. Women have more oxygen efficient, slow twitch fibers, and they burn more fat and less carbohydrates than men during endurance exercise. So basically, what this is saying is that our bodies are pretty much cut out for endurance. Now, there's always exceptions to this, always, but in general. Now, high intensity, and these are the short sprints that we were talking about earlier, is really key as women transition into menopause, and it is highly suggested. Postmenopausal women are not going to get the optimal health benefits from traditional endurance cardio or just brisk walking. So walking is still great. I don't want you to stop walking. Get those steps in, get that movement in, get that zone 2 in, but don't spend a lot of time in that mid zone, zone 3. You want to be spending time in zone 2 and then up toward zone 5. So those are the two zones that have the benefits that are associated with longevity and health span. So women, especially women in menopause, when they transition, they're losing their hormones. We've talked about this. They need very strong stress, good stress, I keep saying that, not the bad stress, like high intensity activity to actually improve their cardiovascular health. Better blood vessel compliance, better heart rate responses, meet their energy demands. This is what they need. So, in addition to the strength training, having a component of HIIT exercise, and we're talking about menopausal women here. It's a little bit different for women in perimenopause, and I'm just going to stop and explain that difference. So, if you're in early perimenopause and you're transitioning into late perimenopause, you're still experiencing those fluctuations, and so you do have to be careful of the stress you put on the body, even the good stress. Women need to be careful of intermittent fasting, not to overfast. They need to be careful not to overly restrict calories, and they need to be careful with the amount of HIIT they do and when they do it. So the women that I work with in their 40s, I generally ask them to look at their energy and sleep levels and maybe not do that HIIT workout on a day where they've slept 3 hours and they're stressed out. So I needed to make that difference between the two because in menopause, the one good thing about it is you do level out. That up and down of the hormones stop. Yes, you're losing hormones and you have to change some lifestyle habits, but you actually have more latitude with certain types of dietary and exercise things. So there was a study, or excuse me, the study that was done that was covered in Outside Magazine. Many believe that they missed an opportunity to really continue on with the HIIT research for postmenopausal women, so they didn't quite take it far enough. The blood loss probably wasn't as big a factor as what it seemed to be, just because of the fact that they had recovered from the blood loss before they started into the HIIT cardio. Enough time had gone by, and then they were following this protocol for 8 weeks. And that was probably had more to do with it. I'm obviously not a doctor or a researcher, but probably had more to do with it. The women were also not really trained. They were just moderately active, so they were hitting the bare minimum of the 150 minutes of exercise per week, and there was no details about the intensity. So we don't know if they were just kind of on their phone, walking around the gym, or if they were actually bringing some intensity to this exercise. So the stress of giving blood and then doing an intense 8-week HIIT program, that was bound to get some improvements, but like I said, the study could have gone a little bit further with this. One critique that I read on the study suggested having a control group that carried on with their usual activity, and then a second group that did the HIIT training only, and a third group that did the blood donation plus the HIIT. And then we would know, was it the blood donation? Was it the HIIT? We would have a clearer idea of actually what was going on. So let's talk about ways that menopausal women can actually improve their endurance. So before I dive into that, the reason this is important, the reason this is important for women and really all people, men and women, is because we first lose the muscle. Then the loss of strength is about double that. And then the loss of speed or power is double that. So we're losing not only the muscle, not only the strength, but the speed and the power along with it. And why should this matter? You might be thinking, why do I need speed when I'm 80? Well, it can prevent a fall if you have those quick reflexes, because research has shown that all of us start to lose those quick twitch muscle fibers as we age, and it accelerates in women in menopause. So I really wanted to make that point. So women in menopause benefit from staying out of that middle ground. I talked about it, that zone 3, and spending time with the resistance training, zone 2, little bit of HIIT. Now you may be asking how much HIIT. I personally, as a health coach, and I have a background in personal training, exercise physiology, I believe that small amounts of HIIT are better. We don't need to be doing 45 minutes a day. I think even a couple of sessions a week, even one session can make a difference, and it doesn't have to be long. A lot of times I do some sprints or some type of speed work that allows me to work those quick twitch fibers, and I'm doing them short and fast, and I'm done with those in 10 minutes, and then I might finish up with my zone 2 cardio. That's my preferred method, and I'll do that 2 to 3 times per week. The best type of HIIT for menopausal women, there's actually two types. The first is the very short, all out effort, such as 30 seconds with a short recovery for 15. And like I said, you wouldn't probably do more than 10 minutes of that. The second type, you go all out, but then you have a longer rest. So basically, if you went all out 30 seconds, you might be giving your body a minute to a minute 30 to recover, and that recovery is going to depend on you. I can't tell you what it is, just when that heart rate starts to drop back down and you feel recovered enough to push for the next one. So there's two different ways we can benefit from those. Women have more oxygen efficient slow twitch fibers, as I mentioned, and because of that, you often see, it's interesting, but you often see women doing really well as they age with these long distance events, these marathons, and sometimes doing better than men overall in them and the ultra marathons. So it's just interesting, but it's really not what we need once we transition through menopause. Once you extend past 60 seconds, because you may be saying, what about doing an all-out push for 60 seconds? To me, you're not truly in zone 5 if you can go a full minute. And then also, when you go past that minute or that 60 seconds, you have a greater increase in cortisol. Now, cortisol gives you energy. It's not a bad hormone. It wakes us up in the morning. We need it. But you don't want it to stay elevated because as a menopausal woman, you already have a problem managing your cortisol levels, and you already have a problem with recovering from stress. So we are more vulnerable to stress. It takes us longer to recover. We're more sensitive. So we don't want to do things that elevate cortisol for long periods of time. So I want to give some credit here. I cited several studies, and I found these studies on Dr. Stacy Sims' website, drstacysims.com. I don't agree with her on every single thing. There are a couple of things she covers with nutrition that I don't entirely agree with, but that's okay because she has brought forth such great information and facts about the type of exercise that benefits women in midlife, and not just midlife, but at that 50-year-old mark, that post-menopause mark and beyond, that it's just great information. So I hope this was helpful. As always, if you have a question, a comment, you can find me on Instagram. My account is at Carol Covino Fitness. That's at Carol Covino Fitness. I do have a Facebook business page. I am not as active on there as I am on my Instagram account, and it's just far easier to message me there with any comments or questions that you have. I also want to encourage you to go to the link in the show notes to apply for the Fit and Fierce program. A class has just started, but I always begin taking applications for the next group ahead of time. So you can go ahead, check that out, fill out the application. Be sure to book a call at the end of that if you feel the program is a good fit for you, and we can discuss it and you can ask any questions. Also, I'm going to give you the link to join my book launch team. We're getting closer to the launch. It is aimed for late April. I'll have an exact date within the next few weeks. Right now, the book is in production and the cover is being produced. It's being formatted. It just went through the copywriting process. But I do want to put that book launch team together, and there will be 3 ways you can participate, from being more involved to being just less involved. So if you're short on time, don't be worried about what does this entail. You'll have 3 different ways that you can participate. So go ahead and get on that list. All of this is in the show notes. And once again, if you cannot locate these things, please do message me on Instagram and I will get you the links. So thank you so much for joining me today. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you every blessing. Bye-bye.